Chapter 23, Political Paralysis in the Gilded Age, 1869 to 1896. This is an interesting segment of the book. The next few chapters all deal with the exact same time period. This one deals with the political stuff, and then I think it's... let's see what happens after that. Then it talks about like urbanization, and then there's a great... a second industrial revolution portion as well. But this is the political one. So this is all of the laws and presidential elections and whatnot for basically a group of presidents who sucked. So it's not the most interesting chapter, and it does kind of take a long time to slug through. This is just a picture from your book. And the only reason I kept it in there is because it's from Chicago. And you can see here it's a busy day on Dearborn and Randolph Street, which is in the Loop. So this is right around the 20th century, the start of the 20th century, around 1900 or so, what the Loop looked like with all those trolley cars and people and all this other stuff. Okay, so after Andrew Johnson, obviously he's not going to run for re-election after the whole impeachment and whatnot, it becomes the election of Ulysses S. Grant. And he's a Republican, even though he had never voted besides one time in the presidential election. That was for a Democrat in 1856, James Buchanan. But his platform was basically, I was awesome in the Civil War, vote for me. And they just talk about the Civil War, Civil War, Civil War. So what you have is something called the bloody shirt, waving the bloody shirt. And you're reviving the gory memories of the Civil War. And they talk about how great Grant was, and then his opponents, Seymour and Blair, are being portrayed as Confederates. Right. So 1864, they're marching in battle for the South, and in 1868, now they're marching to the polling place. When instead of CSA, Confederate States of America, it says KKK. Grant wins, and even though he was a pretty decent general, he was a really bad president. And there's not a whole lot of evidence that he himself was corrupt, but apparently everybody around him was corrupt, and he just kind of let it happen. So he's considered to be one of the worst scandal-prone presidents of all time. Far worse than, really anything we've seen since. The first one we'll talk about is the Credit Mobiliary scandal. It starts in 1872, and it's because a bunch of Union Pacific Railroad guys, so the guys that were really high up in the company, they form a construction company, and they call it the Credit Mobiliary Construction Company. And then what they do is then the Union Pacific hires the Credit Mobiliary Company to build a railroad line. But because they're essentially hiring themselves, they charge themselves a ridiculous amount. And remember, the Union Pacific is getting aided by government funds. So then, of course, they get dividends as high as 348%, which was ridiculous. Then what do they do to keep the congressmen from turning them in, from attacking them? Is they distribute shares of this stock to the congressman. So you can see this is like good old-fashioned corruption at its best. The Fisk and Gold ring, that involved the gold. Fisk and Gould involved gold. And these two guys tried to corner the gold market, basically buy as much gold as they could, which would create very, very high prices, which they could eventually sell. But what they needed to do is they needed to keep the U.S. Treasury from selling any of their own gold. So they involved in lots of bribes and whatnot involved in that. The whiskey ring, this was 1874, 1875, where a bunch of insiders in the government basically robbed the Treasury, robbed the federal government bank accounts, and millions in excise tax on whiskey. So all the way back from the Whiskey Rebellion, we'd been charging taxes on whiskey, and here are some insiders basically stealing those taxes. And lastly, I got the Indian ring, and here the Secretary of War, a guy by the name of William Belknap, he basically took a bunch of bribes from suppliers to the Indian reservations because the federal government got to control what went in and went out of the Indian reservations. This doesn't really involve Grant, but in New York City, they had an extremely corrupt guy by the name of Boss Tweed. He was fat, as you can see there, and he operated out of a place called Tammany Hall. And he basically, if we think of machine politics in Chicago, it was definitely going on in Chicago already at that time, but it was at a much larger scale in New York during this time period. And he basically used bribery, graft, and stuffed the ballot boxes and whatnot. He actually used Irish immigrants to do most of this stuff, whether it be the voting or I'll give you jobs if you do this for me, and bribes. And it was all, he controlled city contracts and all this other stuff. And then every time he does any of this stuff, right, he's taking money. So he finally, it's considered that he steals $200 million from New York City. Now, he's finally uncovered, after really a couple decades of doing this, by the New York Times in particular, or in general, I should say, and the famous illustrator from this time period. Most of the political cartoons you're going to see in this and the next couple chapters are from this guy Thomas Nast, and this is a cartoon from Thomas Nast. And he just draws pictures that kind of tell the tale of what this guy's doing. So this political cartoon you have here, this is before Tweed is arrested. And are the police, is Boss Tweed too big, in other words, to go to prison? Is he too powerful? And it's a play on how fat Tweed is as well. This is a much more common picture that you see on an AP test regarding Boss Tweed. And here he is, fat, standing next to the ballot box. You can see here's the ballot box. And it has here, in counting there is strength. Because his Irish supporters, he would have them vote early and often in elections. And he would pay them to do that. With money, with food, with drinks, with menial jobs. And then he could get whoever he wanted into office. And then when the guys who were in office, of course, they knew how they got in office, and so that they would, basically give him whatever type of city contracts that he wants. And if you're a contractor, you would give him a bribe to get a city contract. You can see how this is formed. So even though he's never the mayor of New York City, he is by far the most powerful person in New York City, and is able to kind of pull all the strings of everybody. Okay, this is from your book. This is not an Enright original here. I know this looks like a 19th century version of Human Centipede, especially what you see going on in this guy's pocket, What I Know About Swallowing by Horace Greeley. But here's the deal with this cartoon. It involves the election or re-election of Grant in 1872. A lot of Republicans didn't like Grant because of all the scandals. The Democrats, of course, hated Grant because of all the scandals. And so the Democrats, they pick this guy, Horace Greeley, all right? And it's odd that they do. Well, the reason why they pick him is because he was an editor of a newspaper, and he was kind of like a Thomas Nast, where he, would rail against all of the corruption and stuff like that. So they figured, oh, this is a good guy. Like, he's going to appear pure and the anti-Grant. The problem is that Greeley had spent the last several years, if not more, attacking the Democrat Party. I mean, he had claimed throughout the 1850s and 1860s, he called the Democrat Party traitors, slave shippers, saloon keepers, horse thieves, and idiots. And so now they make him their own candidate. So that's why you see here Horace Greeley, and I don't know what's going on with the other guy, trying to swallow each other. What this results in is an easy, well, I shouldn't say easy, the re-election of Ulysses Grant in 1872. And then as soon as Grant is re-elected, the very next year, you get the Panic of 1873. We've talked already several times about the cyclical nature of capitalism and how you get boom bust periods. And it happens approximately every 20 years or so. And before this, you had the Panic of 1857. If you'll recall, that's where the people who grew cotton thought that cotton was king because they didn't suffer from the recession. Well, here you get another recession, this time in 1873. And again, there are so many parallels to our own modern day recessions. Here is almost an exact quote from your book. Overreaching promoters had laid more railroad tracks, sunk more mines, erected more factories, and sowed more grain fields than existing markets could bear. Bankers had made too many dumb loans to finance those enterprises. And when they didn't get profits because not enough people could buy this stuff anymore, then they couldn't pay back the loans that they had got to make all this stuff. And when they couldn't pay back the loans, then the banks go out of business and they close. And since this is all based on loans, right? It's all based on credit. It's really a house of cards and it collapses. And look, let's face it, that's exactly what happened in the last 6 or 7 years. Here you have, for the first time, really, we're going to start talking about monetary policy. And what monetary policy is controlling the amount of money in circulation and the type of money. Because really, I don't want to say for the first time, but for the first time in heavy use during the Civil War, we used paper dollars, right? They were called greenbacks. But most people outside of this thought that greenbacks were untrustworthy, and so they preferred something that had tangible value, like gold. So you would have gold money, perhaps other types of precious metals. Now, if you are in debt, you want an increase in the money supply, because if you borrowed $100 and now the money supply increases, that $100 actually is worth less than it was at the time that you borrowed it. It's easier for you to get $100 because there's more money in circulation. So debtors sought inflation. And how do you do that during this time period? Well, you continue circulating paper money, these greenbacks, or you even increase that. Creditors, on the other hand, they want just the opposite. They want something called deflation. They loan you $100, and now they're hoping that at some point that less money winds up in circulation. And that means that the cost of that $100 then increases because there's less money around. So they were very, very anti-paper money, anti-greenback. Not only did they not want any more greenbacks into circulation, but they wanted something called redemption. And that's basically where the government forces you to turn in your paper money and get tangible precious metal money in return, in this instance gold. And so this is all going on. So the people who are out of work and still owe money, and the people who can't make their mortgage payments and loan payments during this panic of 1873, they want greenbacks. And big businesses who are still surviving and still want money paid to them, they don't. And they win, and they get the 1875 Specie Redemption Act. That's the Resumption Act, is actually another term for it, where people had to turn in their paper money. You get a single issue political party kind of erupts from this in 1876. They're called the Greenback Party, and they basically, their whole thing is, let's increase the money supply and let's use paper money. Here you get the presidential election now of 1876. And you can see how unbelievably close it is. You get Hayes, the Republican, and Tilden, the Democrat. And then you can see some contested areas. Of course, it involves Florida, right? They never know how to vote down there. And you can see that the electoral vote is a tie, right? 50%. At that time, you needed 186 electoral votes in order to become president. So Tilden wins the popular vote, but as you know from studying the Constitution, the popular vote essentially means nothing. It's all about the electoral vote. And so since neither candidate got a majority of the electoral vote, they had to really count, because these states here, Louisiana, South Carolina, Florida, and apparently one portion of Oregon that no one talks about, it was so close that each each candidate was claiming to be the victor. And so you get, very similar to what happens in 2000, where it goes to the courts and it goes to these different election commissions in these 3 states. And of course, depending on who controls the state, they're going to say that their guy wins, right? So it becomes this big fight, and this fight takes over a month. And eventually you get to the Compromise of 1877. And as a result of this compromise, the Democrats agree to lose again. And Hayes can take office. In return, what they got in the deal is the withdrawal of federal troops from the South. So Reconstruction finally ends in 1877 with the removal of those federal troops. Republicans also assured Democrats patronage jobs. Remember when we talked about, with Andrew Jackson, the spoil system, where once you're elected, you kick out all the old guys who had cush federal jobs, and you put in all your buddies, all the guys who helped you get elected, either by giving you money or getting out the vote. So Republicans, guarantee, I guess assure, not guarantee, Democrats that they'll get some of the patronage jobs, and that the Republicans will support a bill subsidizing a southern transcontinental railroad line. Think all the way back to Stephen Douglas and that fight in the Gadsden Purchase, right? Is there going to be a northern transcontinental railroad line, or is there going to be a southern one? The northern one had been built, or was in the process of being built, and now the South still wanted a southern one, and so they needed Republican support in Congress to do so. So those are the details of this compromise. What's the result of this? Basically, this means that the Republican Party, which, remember, their whole platform originally in the 1850s was to stop the expansion of slavery, and once they do so, then it focuses on equality for African Americans. By engaging the Compromise of 1877, they're essentially abandoning their racial goals, their racial morality, I guess you'd say. They just want to stay in power now, right? They get the taste of Washington, D.C., and they want to keep it. And if they have to keep it by abandoning the black man, they're going to do that. And so what you get now is the Jim Crow era. Jim Crow, we're going to have a whole lecture in class. I'm going to show you lots of nasty pictures about lynchings and stuff like that. But that's in the future. For specifically, what you have to know for this chapter is the Jim Crow laws. It's a series of Southern laws. These are state laws by various states from the former Confederates that discriminate against blacks. And primarily, we're talking about segregation, voter registration, poll taxes, literacy tests, anything to try and keep blacks out of the political power. So denying them the right to vote and forcing them, as like subservient status to Southern whites. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court agrees with them in 1896 in the famous case of Plessy versus Ferguson, which said that so the government, whether it be state or federal, can create separate facilities. So it's, in other words, publicly sanctioned segregation, and that's constitutional under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Plessy's finally overturned by Brown versus Board of Education in the 1950s. So you can see it exists for about 50, 60 years there. This is a picture of your book of a man who's about to be lynched. Like I said, you're going to see a lot worse than this in the future. And this is also a picture from her book, and it shows you, remember in the last lecture I told you was the unfortunate reality is that an African American in 1870 was probably doing the same thing with the same tools, living in the same area, working for the same guy as he did in 1860. And this is just like a little anecdote, a little caption, a little snapshot from your book, and it shows what this plantation looked like in 1860 and what it looked like in 1881. But these slaves are now these guys' tenants, right? And whereas he used to be the master, now he's the landlord. But same stuff's happening. Now, lynchings, and again, we're going to talk a lot more about this, but the early lynchings, these were basically the scalawags and the carpetbaggers. The focus of lynching initially was really focused towards whites. Once the Redeemers, so the Southern Confederates, reobtain power in the South, and they kick out all of the Northern sympathizers, then they're able to focus their efforts on African Americans. I have a different table too, with vastly different tallies for both whites and blacks lynchings. My table's much higher, so I kind of contest this table from your book. And it wasn't just blacks who were being picked on. You also out west have the Chinese. Chinese were a fairly small minority, just limited to the West Coast, and they were competing with, again, the Irish and African Americans for just the cheapest, the hardest, the most dangerous jobs around. And given all the aftermath of the 1870s, the painful economic realities at the time, one of the ways of reducing unemployment is to reduce the number of workers. So how do you do that? Well, you just kick out a group that doesn't have a whole lot of political power. At this time, so many Irish had moved into the United States that we're now 2-3 generations deep, and they are starting to control the mechanisms of government. The Chinese were not. And so, kick out the Chinese. So you get the Chinese Exclusionary Act in 1882, which basically prohibits all immigration from China for the next 70 or so years. It's really not until World War II that the Chinese are allowed to immigrate to the United States again. All right, we talked a little bit about patronage, and there involves then a patronage war. And the Democrats were involved in this also, but the problem is that the Democrats, they weren't in political power. Remember, the last time that they controlled Washington was the 1850s. So here we are, 1860s is a Republican decade, 1870s is a Republican decade, and we get to the 1880s. So we get, a solid 25 years or so of Republicans controlling all of the major positions of power in government in Washington, D.C. And so these guys had lifers, right? And so you start to get a lot of infighting within the Republican Party. And they're going over, it's all about patronage, this idea of dispersing jobs for votes. Because they're stealing each other's votes, right? And you get the stalwart faction versus the half-breeds. The stalwart faction, they were led by Roscoe Conkling. He was a New York senator, and he was all about patronage, right? Give me as much money as you can, and I'll give you a job once I'm elected. The half-breeds were led by James Blaine. He was a Maine congressman, and he still believed in patronage, but he at least talked the good talk about civil service reform, of saying that patronage wasn't the best thing. Personally, I think he was on the losing end, so he was crying foul as he was being a sore loser. But I think if he had the more powerful faction during this time period, he would have been essentially a stalwart. So this brings us then, who is going to be the presidential candidate from the Republican Party in 1880? Because you have the two segments of the Republican Party are the half-breeds and the stalwarts. And so they end up compromising in James Garfield. Now, James Garfield was, kind of an unknown. His best attribute was he was from the state of Ohio. The state of Ohio has always been a swing state. It's important in that it's so borderline Democrat Republican that both parties like to pick candidates from that state in order to get that state, and it usually has a lot of electoral votes because it's got so many people living in there. So they compromise. They get Garfield, and then as his vice presidential running mate, you get a guy by the name of Chester A. Arthur. In addition to having an awesome name and awesome mutton chops, he was a stalwart. So he was Conkling's guy. So you kind of get Garfield, who was kind of a half-breed, and the vice presidential running mate was a definite stalwart. I think, if I remember right, Chester A. Arthur had something to do with the customs office in New York. And as you can imagine, the customs office where they inspect ships and collect taxes, you're just asking for, Boss Tweed type corruption going on there. And Chester Arthur was notorious for it. So that's why he was so popular among the stalwarts. And, of course, they win. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't be talking about them, right? So Garfield wins the election of 1880. So you get yet another Republican president in a row. This was, quite the run for the Republican Party. And then he's killed. So shortly after his election, 1881, he's assassinated. He's assassinated by this guy, Charles Guiteau, who was a nut job. And after he shoots Garfield in the back there, you can see he's not having lower back problem. He's just got shot. Charles Guiteau says, "I am a stalwart, and Arthur is president now." So, huzzah! And the reason he does that is because Guiteau thought that he would get one of these patronage positions. And when he was ignored by Garfield, I don't even know if Garfield even knew who he was, he gets pissed off and he kills. So then he, I guess, assumes that he's going to get either pardoned by Chester A, or that they're not going to press charges. But of course, the federal government presses charges, and then they execute him. So what we have here is that the Chester A. Arthur, who is a stalwart and who is notorious for patronage, is now the president of the United States. But because of the assassination of Garfield and because it was all about patronage, the Republican Party starts to have second thoughts about how just greedy they are with all this patronage stuff. But you still got the underlings, these guys down here, who are looking for sweet jobs, right? Who are looking for stuff. And this is Chester A. Arthur hiding behind the door as these guys are trying to break into the vault, right? And Chester A. ends up being the opposite of a stalwart once he becomes president. And he does not believe in patronage. And the Republicans who were in office at the time, they actually pass the Pendleton Act, which is called the Magna Carta of Civil Service Reform. It makes compulsory campaign contributions from federal employees illegal, and that is true to this day. Federal and state employees are not, they can't be forced, in other words, to contribute to the political campaigns of their bosses. But that was before the Pendleton Act. Not only was that regular, but it was essentially mandatory. And in addition to that, you had to have some qualifications to get one of these government jobs now. You couldn't just be the cousin to the governor or the nephew of the president. You actually had to have some sort of background in whatever job that you're doing. And they set up a bunch of competitive examinations. Think ACT, right? Like a subject-specific ACT for whatever job that you want. And if you pass it, then you can be appointed to that position. If you don't pass it, well, you're screwed. The unintended, I'm going to say unintended effect to all this is that politicians then could not look to their individual followers for money now. But they're still politicians, right? They still need to finance their campaigns. And with every election, it's almost exponentially increases in expenditures that these campaigns have to do. So they had to look elsewhere for money. So who else has money during this time period? Well, big corporations. We're going to talk about the rise of corporations either in the next chapter or the chapter after that. And they had lots of money, they had lots of power, and they wanted lots of influence. And how do you do that? Well, you make sure that your guy gets elected. So this is really, you start to see the shift between from individual donations to corporate donations. This is the civil service, the totality of people who work for the federal government and the percentage that are required to take these competitive examinations. So you can see in the aftermath of the Pendleton Act, it was only 10% of government positions needed to pass an exam, but there was only 131,000 people working for the federal government at that time. And it rises and it rises, and you can see it explodes during this time period here. And it's basically because of World War II that the federal government just massively increases in the number of people who work for them. And it's essentially, you can see, remained static ever since. From the time period of, we'll say, 1952 to modern day, there's only been an increase of 200,000 or so, 250,000 federal workers. Now that's huge considering the increase in population, the increase in government expenditures, and all that. What you've noticed though, the trend and the big dip between this and this, 90% to 57%, is something that it initially involved the post office, and that removed postal service employees from these type of jobs where they could just be hired, in other words. And they created a specific category called accepted service. And accepted service means you don't have to pass these tests. And of course, the presidents since then, they want any type of, you know, future federal employee, they would love for that person to be in the accepted service because it goes back to the old patronage system. And you can see, so we've gone lower and lower and lower. So the percentage of federal employees keeps getting smaller because they keep creating new jobs that they call accepted service jobs. So it increases the patronage. So we've almost come full circle. Yay, government. Oh, and now we get good old Grover Cleveland. First Democrat in a long, long time to win the presidency. And he's twice president with a 4-year break in between. The only guy ever to do that in American history also. Also not a big fan of physical fitness. He's kind of got the Boss Tweed six-pack going on there. And this campaign was, a pretty bad one as far as mudslinging, which, it's always funny. Politicians, the press talks about how negative campaigns are nowadays and how it didn't used to be that way, and they're wrong, right? I mean, we've already studied some of the worst ones of all time. Remember the campaign of 1800 where John Adams was accused of being a pimp for the Tsar of Russia, and Thomas Jefferson was accused of being a slave raper. Now, he was a slave raper, but details, right? And then there was all the Andrew Jackson stuff with Rachel, and then Andrew Jackson wanted to kill Henry Clay for that, and so on and so forth. Abe Lincoln was considered to be some sort of gorilla or something. They were making like ape-like references to him. And here we get poor old Grover Cleveland, who was a bachelor and paid for, I think it was college or something like that, for some guy of a woman that he knew back in the day. And so, of course, the Republicans claimed that Grover Cleveland fathered this kid out of Republicans claimed that he fathered this kid out of wedlock, and so they made posters like this that said, "Mama, where's my pa?" To which the Democrats replied after the election to the White House, "Ha ha ha." There you go. Cleveland wins. Good for Cleveland. Now, whenever you get a regime change, well, it's not in the AP government style, but from a political spectrum, we finally have a Democrat in the White House. You're going to get a lot of change, right? And he is known as the veto governor. And this man was hardcore laissez-faire. Very, very different than the modern day Democrat Party. Because here's a quote from your book. Though the people support the government should not support the people. He believed in absolutely no social welfare programs whatsoever. He didn't even want to help out Civil War veterans. So he opposed any and all bills that assisted the poor. And he also opposed any type of tax support or anything like that that would help the rich also. He didn't want to help anybody. He wanted a very, very small government. And you can see here he vetoed over 200 special pension bills for Civil War veterans. And your book talks about this. A lot of these were BS bills, where guys who really had never served in the Civil War or had kind of inglorious ways of getting out of duty, but technically were still on the payroll. They wanted pensions, and so they needed to have Congress vote for them. And for decades they were getting them until Cleveland. Cleveland started vetoing all this stuff. Then we get the tariff. The tariff issue becomes huge during this time period. There was a very big tariff starting in the Civil War because the Union Army needed money, right? And so the North jacked up the tariff so they could make money off of imports. Yeah, imports. And then the government kept these tariffs in the 1870s in the beginning part of the 1880s because you get the second wave of the Industrial Revolution, which is in high gear during this time period. And so all these factories, they want to be protected from foreign competition. And remember, they're supporting big government, so big government supporting them. In 1885, we actually had an over $100 million a year surplus. Right? This is very, very different than our multi-trillion dollar deficits that we have every year nowadays under the Obama administration. Now, oddly enough, here you have a Democrat who wants to lower this tariff, right? And so tariffs become a major issue in the 1888 presidential election, and because he wants to lower the tariff, and the Republicans want to keep it there, or they would probably love to even increase the tariff a little bit. Here you're going to pull a cartoon, and it has here, this is one of Cleveland supporters, obviously, and it has that the factory is closed on account of the tariff. You can see everybody here is crying, probably starving to death and whatnot. Meanwhile, there's no smoke coming out of here because the factories are all closed. What happens? Benjamin Harrison, the grandson of William Henry Harrison, who, remember, he served for the glorious 31 days or so. He wins. Okay, so you got a Republican back in power in D.C. And then nothing really happens. All right, that's all you really have to know about Benjamin Harrison. But during this time period, the farmers are getting pissed. And they're getting pissed because you can see in the 1860s it was good to be a farmer. Right? You're making a lot of money. You can see this chart here, this index, I guess. Farmers are going to receive better prices for their products than they pay. So in other words, they're making lots of money here. The higher the gap of blue, the more money farmers are going to make. And you can see because more and more people farm, and because more and more acreage goes into farming, and because more and more advances in technology allow for higher yields, that means that the price for farm products is going to go down. Whenever you're increasing the supply and not increasing the demand, then prices are going to go down. However, the price for all of the stuff that they have to pay for, modern day tractors and whatnot, that goes up. And so it gets to the point where now, in the 1880s, it sucks to be a farmer. Right? You're not making enough money. So really, you could be a sharecropper. You're getting deeper and deeper in debt every year. Or if you're just an ordinary white farmer who's not, renting land, who actually owns his own land, or actually probably is paying mortgage payments on the land, you're losing more and more money every year as well. And the farmers blamed Washington for this. And so they start their own political party. And it starts off as various different ones. There was the Granger Party, then there was the Farmers Alliance, then there was the Northern Farmers Alliance, and so on. And it all turns into eventually the populist, otherwise known as the People's Party. And here you go. It's founded by James Weaver, the dude with the fancy goatee over there on the right, and Tom Watson, not the golfer. And kind of their heyday was in the 1890s, and there was lots of stuff that they believed in, and they wind up being a failure of a party. But the next slide is going to talk about all the stuff that they wanted, and the federal government ends up adopting almost all of it, and it basically becomes a fight between the Republicans and the Democrats as to which party is going to assume the People's Party, the Populist Party platform. And you get this weird time period in the early 1900s then where the Republicans and the Democrats are both extremely liberal. And then that kind of turns into then the modern, eventually it plays out to all the way into the 1920s and 30s into the modern platforms of the Republicans and the Democrats. Now, so these guys run as a third party, and they get a ton of votes. They're probably, if not the most, one of the most successful third party in American political history. They win several congressional seats, a couple governorships, but they don't win. Obviously, they don't win the presidency. And here's their platform. a system of sub-treasuries. So they were kind of anti-national bank. They didn't like this. They were similar in their monetary philosophy as far as credit to Andrew Jackson's supporters. And remember, you got a lot of Western farmers who want easy access to money. Pretty much the same type of thing. And so as a result of that, you don't want this centralized monolithic bank on the East Coast somewhere. You want a bunch of, lot more banks and closer to you. They wanted the direct election of senators. Remember, during this time period, the state legislatures chose the senators. They wanted the government ownership of railroads, the telephone, and telegraph companies, basically because they thought they were being screwed on rates by this. If you're a farmer in Kansas and you want to sell your corn to New York, you have to pay shipping costs for that on the railroads, and the railroads get to dictate what those fees are going to be. So the farmers in the Midwest thought that they were being gouged with all this stuff, and so they felt if the government owned that there could be statutory rates that they could play that would be much fair. They could pay that would be much fairer towards them. Government operated postal savings banks, the restriction of undesirable immigration. Remember, they didn't want this was they're trying to court the urban working class vote as well. And so if you're a factory worker in Boston or Chicago or New York, you're competing with the other poor people, and so you don't want new poor people thrown in the mix. So restriction of undesirable immigration. Think Chinese. Think future European immigration. 8-hour workday for government employees. The abolition of the Pinkerton Detective Agency. The Pinkertons, they were kind of like a domestic mercenary group. Remember, during the Civil War, they were originally used as spies by Abraham Lincoln. In the aftermath of the Civil War, they were turned into just this big company of thugs. And if you were a business, you could hire this company to attack or intimidate your workers who were on strike. So if they're outside your factory picketing, you might hire the Pinkertons to go in there and kick their ass. The Australian secret ballot. Remember, this is the time period where your ballots, were bright blue for Democrat and bright red for Republican. You had to walk down a big line in front of everybody. Everybody kind of knew who you were voting for before you voted. The Australian secret ballot, it was obviously invented in Australia. Nobody knows who you voted for, and there's really no way of finding out. The remonetization of silver. This is a big one. If they want more money added to the money supply because they're in favor of inflationary policies, because for the most part they are debtors, and so they want the amount of money that they owe to the banks to be worth less than it was originally, and they want easier access to credit, somehow you need to increase the money supply. You can do that through greenbacks, the paper money, or you could do that by increasing the type of precious metals to be used for money. So in addition, this is why I have those coins at the top there, in addition to using gold as money, why not use silver also? And so they wanted to have silver added to the money supply. They also wanted term limits, a single term for the president and the vice president, because they wanted to decrease the corruption. Here's a picture of your book of some factory workers, or not factory workers, farm workers. I don't know what their harvester there. Oh, they're loading a Husker shredder in the 1890s. So it involves corn. So instead of husking corn by hand and then shredding it, probably with like a knife or something like that, you can just throw it all in that big machine and it'll do it for you. You're able to increase the output, but this thing also costs a lot of money. The Homestead Strike, this actually involves a loss for the Pinkertons. The Pinkertons are down here. There was a big strike of steel workers who were pissed off that their pay was getting cut and stuff like that. And so I can't remember who was. Oh, it was Carnegie. So this is near Pittsburgh, and Carnegie Steel Company, which we'll talk about Andrew Carnegie in the future. They hire the Pinkertons and they boat them down the river. I think there was like 300, something like that. There's hundreds of Pinkertons, and they were sent there to beat up the striking workers. And the striking workers, though, knew that they were coming. So as soon as the Pinkertons got off the boat, they beat the hell out of them. And so that's the big fight that's going on here. What you got to know about this and other strikes during this time period is that the government gave no help whatsoever to the workers. Oftentimes they declared that the strikes were illegal, that the unions, even forming a union, was illegal, and so the federal government would actually send in federal troops to aid the Pinkertons in putting an end to these various strikes. Here you can see the election of 1892, and you can see how popular the Populist Party was in the Midwest, the Midwestern area. The Populists, they're the green. And kind of their base of power really was in Kansas. It's going to become important for our Wizard of Oz discussion in the future, in the near future. But you can see that Cleveland wins again. So Grover Cleveland is back in the White House in 1892. And then what happens to him? You get the Depression of 1893. It's been exactly 20 years now, right? We had the Panic of 1873. Now we get the Depression of 1893. And how is it caused? By the exact same stuff as what caused the recession of 1873. Overbuilding and speculation. This time you can add in some labor disorders, and the decrease in price for agricultural products also creates a lot of depression. And the populace kind of have themselves to blame to a certain extent, because if your common American person is getting money from an American bank, well, your American bank is getting its money oftentimes from European banks, specifically specifically Great Britain, because they were still the richest, entity in the world, and so America got a lot of its loans from Great Britain. Well, obviously, Great Britain and the rest of Europe, they are not going to be crazy about all of these cries for increasing the money supply in the United States, and especially with this whole free silver debate of adding silver to the money stock. Because if you do that, you're creating inflation, you're increasing the money supply, so that American loans that are being repaid to European banks, they're going to be worth less than the amount of money that those Europeans had originally loaned the Americans. So the European banks, they start calling in their loans once things look bad, because they want to get paid before America has a chance to pay them back in depreciated silver and paper money. You're getting a heavy dose of monetary policy this chapter. And that's it. Now we're at finally our last slide. It's been a riveting lecture. And you have here Grant wins the election of 1868. You get the Fisk and Gould gold market scandal. You get the Tweed scandal in New York, which was actually going on for decades. 1872, you get the Credit Mobiliary scandal. Grant wins re-election in 1872. You get the Panic of 1873. 1875, you get the Whiskey Ring scandal. You get the Resumption Act. That's the species redemption. 1876, you get the Hills-Tilden election, standoff. It says there. You get the Compromise of 1877. You get Garfield wins in 1880, and then he's promptly assassinated in 1881. The stalwarts take office with Chester A. Arthur, and then Chester A. Arthur ignores them. You get the Chinese Exclusionary Act in 1882. You get the Pendleton Act in 1883. Cleveland wins the presidency in 1884. Nothing happens then, besides remember all that tariff fight. Then you get Harrison wins 1888, and then nothing happens during his presidency. You get the Homestead Steel Strike in 1892, which we talked about. You get a lot of populist party type stuff happening there. Cleveland wins re-election. You get the Depression of 1893. Some J.P. Morgan stuff, which we'll talk about in future chapters. And then, of course, Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, separate but